Okay, good day, students. Today we are going to start with our lecture number 27 of Sociolinguistics, and it is going to be a continuation of what we were studying before. Now, when we were studying about the different languages and how languages are adjusted in societies and according to societies. So languages, dialects and varieties. Now if we go and look into all these three aspects, first languages, how they are used, how they are produced, how they affect society. Then dialects, the difference of a different language, or how a similar language can have different dialects. Let's say, for example, like I told you, a version of English, let's say, so a British English or the American English or an Australian English, they would be the basic same language, English, but with different pronunciations maybe, or a few words here and there that don't match. So that would be considered as a dialect. Now, the varieties in dialects and the varieties in a language, that's what we want to study today. So, for it is quite unlike any other existing system. Now, actually, neither the requirement that there be internal variations nor the numbers game. So, that is that a language must somehow be bigger than a dialect. That offers much help. So, many languages have only a handful of speakers. So several have actually been known to have had only a single remaining speaker at a particular point in time, and the language has died with that speaker. So some languages are in a such way that you can say that maybe one person or an elderly person of that community or that country would be speaking a specific language, and then when that person and his generation dies out, instead of transferring that language from generation to generation, that language is sort of, it dies with the person. So the language sort of dies out, and then a new language would emerge. So in language, we say that somehow must be bigger than a dialect. Language being bigger than a dialect would mean that language is as a whole a different language from a different, totally different base, different pronunciation, different alphabets, different grammatical rules. But a dialect could have the same grammatical rules, the same maybe alphabets, but different pronunciations, or vice versa. So when we say that a speaker at a particular point in time in the language died with that speaker, that means that a language is going on in a community, and suddenly when people stop speaking that language and move to different languages, that language would be considered as a dead language. Still another difficulty arises from the fact that the terms language and dialect are also used in a historical sense. Now, it is possible to speak of languages such as English, German or French or Russian or Hindi as Indo-European dialects. So in this case, the assumption is that there was once a single language, Indo-European, and that the speaker of that language, which may have had various dialects, spreads to different parts of the world, and that the original language eventually diverged into the various languages we subsume today under the Indo-European family of languages. So, however, now when we look at things, we should also be aware that this process of divergence was not as clean-cut as this classical neo-grammarian model of language differentiation suggests. So in such a model, all breaks are clean, and once two varieties diverge, they lose contact with each other. So that would be another important factor. Now, processes of convergence. When we study about processes of convergence, we would say that it must also have occurred even of the convergence among entirely unrelated languages. That is, language without any family resemblance. Now, for example, Indo-European and Dravidian languages have influenced each other in southern India and Sri Lanka. So, and in the Balkans, there is considerable evidence of the spread of common features across languages such as the Albanian, the Greek, the Turkish, and several Slavic languages. So in such situations, language and dialect differences become further obscured, particularly when many speakers are also likely to be multilingual. Now, perhaps some of the difficulties we have with trying to define the term language arise from trying to subsume various different types of systems of communication under that one label. So an alternative approach might be to acknowledge that there are different kinds of languages and attempt to discover how languages can differ from one another, yet still be entities that most of us would want to call languages rather than dialects. So it might then be possible to define a dialect as some sub-variety of one or more of these entities. So one such attempt, we could see Bell in 1976 has listed 7 criteria that may be useful in discussing different kinds of languages. Now, according to Bell, these criteria, standardizations, vitality, and the historicity, or autonomy, or reduction, or mixture of and the de facto norms may be used to distinguish certain languages from other languages. Now, they also make it possible to speak of some languages as being more developed in certain ways than others, thus addressing a key issue in the language, dialect distinction. Now, since speakers usually feel that languages are generally better than dialects in some sense. So, yes, a language would be more superior to, let's say, a dialect. So, the language and dialect distinction would be very, very clear. Because languages would be like are more developed, and dialects are using part of one particular language. So standardization refers to the process by which a language has been codified in some way. So that process usually involves the development of such things as grammars, spelling books and dictionaries, and possibly a literature. So we can often associate specific items or events with standardization. For example, Wycliffe's and Luther's translations of the Bible into English and German, respectively Caxton's establishment of printing in England, and Dr. Johnson's Dictionary of English published in 1755. So standardization also requires that a measure of agreement be achieved about what is in the language and what is not. So once we have such and varieties, a codification of the language, we tend to see it as almost inevitable. The result of some process come to fruition, one that has also reached a fixed end point. So change, therefore, should be resisted, since it can only undo what has been done so laboriously. Now, Milroy in 2001 researched and said that characterizes the resulting ideologies as follow. So the canonical form of the language, his first ideology was the canonical form. The canonical form of language is a precious inheritance that has been built up over the generations. So not by the millions of native speakers, but by a select few who have lavished loving care upon it, polishing, refining, and enriching it until it has become a fine instrument of expression. Now, often these are thought to be literally figures, such as Shakespeare. So this is a view held by the people in many walks of life, including plumbers, politicians, professors of literature, and so forth. And we would say that because of maybe a politician would have a different way of speaking a language than, let's say, a professor would. So you can say that yes, it is very, very distinction or very, very different from what the other person would be saying or speaking. So then when we say that it is believed that if the canonical variety is not universally supported and protected, the language will inevitably decline and decay. According to that, students, now when we were discussing different things, now let's say that the view held by people, the canonical form of language is a precious inheritance that has been built because over the generations. So not by the millions of native speakers. So it's not the way how many people would speak a certain dialect or language, but it matters on how long ago that language was developed and how well it would be. Now, we would say that by selecting an expression of a language, or polishing or refining or enriching that language until it has become a fine instrument of expression. Now, often these are thought to be literary figures such as Shakespeare. So Shakespeare, we would say, would be a literary figure who polished and refined and enriched a certain amount of the language and then produced it. So in his literary works. So this is a view held by people in many walks of life, including plumbers, politicians, and professors of literature. So it is believed that if the canonical variety is not universally supported and protected, the language will inevitably decline and decay. So if they don't support that language, it'll basically everybody will start speaking it, and when they stop speaking the language, then gradually it would fade from the memories of people, and the language would gradually decline and decay. That means that it would die and it would finish. So once a language is standardized, it becomes possible to teach it in a deliberate manner. Now, it takes in ideological dimensions, social, cultural, and sometimes political, beyond the purely linguistic ones. So in Fairclough's words, it becomes part of a much wider process of economic, political, and cultural unification. Now, of great importance in the establishment of nationhood and the nation-state is the favored form of capitalism. So according to these criteria, both English and French are quite obviously standardized. So Italian somewhat less so, and the variety known as African American Vernacular English not at all. So according to Hugon, in 1966, he indicated certain steps that must be followed if one variety of language is to become a standard for that language. So in addition to what he calls the formal matters of codification and elaboration, the former referring to the development of such things as grammars and dictionaries, and the later referring to the use of the standard in areas as literature, the courts, or the education and administration and commerce, Hugon says that there are different matters to do with function. So, for example, a norm must be selected and accepted because neither codification nor elaboration is likely to proceed very far if the community cannot agree on some kind of model to act as a norm. Now, that norm is also likely to be or to become an idealized form, one that users of the language are asked to aspire to rather than one that actually accords with their observed behaviors. So, selection of the norm may prove difficult because choosing one vernacular as a norm means favoring those who speak that variety. So, it also diminishes all the other varieties and possible competing norms and those who use those varieties. So the chosen norm inevitably becomes associated with power, and the rejected alternatives with lack of power. So not surprisingly, it usually happens that a variety associated with an elite is chosen. So attitudes are all important. However, a group that feels intense solidarity may be willing to overcome great linguistic differences in establishing a norm. So whereas one that does not have this feeling may be unable to overcome relatively small differences and may be unable to agree on a single variety and norm. So Serbs and Croats were never able to agree on a norm, particularly as other differences reinforced linguistic ones. So in contrast, we can see how Indonesia and Malaysia are looking for ways to reduce the differences between their languages and their common Islamic bond, a strong incentive. So Indonesia and Malaysia, because they are Muslim countries, they would want to make their Islamic bond strong. So they want to see how they can reduce the difference between their language so that their bond would become more stronger. And now the standardization process itself performs a variety of functions. It unifies individuals and groups within a large community, while at the same time separating the community that results from other communities. So at the same time they're doing that, the standardization process would work in different functions in a way that it would unify individuals, it would make them come together into groups or a larger community, while at the same time separating that community that results from other communities. So it can unify individuals of, let's say, one speaking category into one community and then separate the other speaking category into a different community. So when they are dividing the communities, you can see that standardization process would perform that function. So therefore it can be employed to reflect and symbolize some kind of identity, regional, social, ethnic, or religious. So it can be an ethnic reason, it can be a social situation, it can be due to religious views. So a standardized variety can also be used to give prestige to speakers. यानी उन लोगों को एक high position देना society में is very important, and language can, a standardized variety of language can do that. Now marking off those who employ it from those who do not. That is, those who continue to speak a non-standard variety, it can therefore serve as a kind of goal for those who have somewhat different norms. Now standard English and standard French are such goals for many whose norms and are dialects of these languages. So it still may not be at all easy for us to define the standard English because of failure to agree about the norm or norms that should apply. For example, Trudgill defines standard English as follows. So note his use of usually and normally in this definition. So standard English is that a variety of English which is usually used in print and which is normally taught in schools and to non-native speakers learning the language. So it is also the variety which is normally spoken by educated people and used in news broadcasts and other similar situations. So the difference between standard and non-standard, it should be noted, has nothing in principle to do with differences between formal and colloquial language, or with concepts such as bad language. Now standard English has colloquial as well as formal variants. So, and standard English speakers swear as much as others. So historically the standard variety of English is based on the dialect of English that developed after the Norman conquest. Now resulted in the permanent removal of the court from Winchester to London. So the dialect became the one preferred by the educated, and it was developed and promoted as a model or norm for wider and wider segments of society. So it was also the norm that was carried overseas, but not as unaffected by such support or such export. So today, Standard English is codified to the extent that the grammar and vocabulary of English are much the same everywhere in the world. So variation among the local standards is really quite minor, being difference of flavor rather than of substance, so that the Singapore or South African and Irish varieties are really very little different from one another so far as the grammatical rules are concerned or the vocabulary is concerned. So we would say that the Singaporean and the South African or the Irish varieties of language are not that different. So indeed, Standard English is so powerful that it exerts a tremendous pressure on all local varieties, to the extent that many of the long-established dialects of England and the lowlands, so English of Scotland, have lost much of their vigor. There is considerable pressure on them to converge towards the standard. So this latter situation is not unique to English. It is also true in other countries in which processes of standardization are under the way. So it does, however, sometimes create problems for speakers who try to strike some kind of compromise between local norms and national, even supranational ones. Now, governments sometimes very deliberately involve themselves in the standardization process. Now, why would they do that? They would do it because by establishing official bodies of one kind or another to regulate language matters or to encourage change felt to be desirable. So one of the most famous examples of an official body established to promote the language of a country was Richelieu's establishment of Academia Francaise in 1635. Now, founded at the time when a variety of languages existed in France, when literary was confined to a very few, and when there was little national consciousness. So the Académie Francaise faced an unenviable task. So the codification of French spelling, vocabulary and grammar. So its goal was to fashion and reinforce French nationality, a most important task considering that even 2 centuries later, in the early 19th century, the French of Paris were virtually unknown in many parts of the country, particularly in the south. So similar attempts to find academies in England and the United States for the same purpose met with no success also. So individual dictionary makers and grammar writers having performed much the same function for English. So since both French and English are today highly standardized, one might question whether such academies serve a purposeful, useful purpose. So yet it is difficult to imagine France without the Académie Francaise. It undoubtedly has had a considerable influence on the French people and perhaps on their language also. So it does make a huge difference, you see. Now, standardization is sometimes deliberately undertaken quite rapidly for political reasons. So in the 19th century, Finns developed their spoken language to make it serve a complete set of functions. So they need a standardized language to assert their independence from both Swedes and Russians. So what they needed was a standardized language. Now, just fighting over the land or gaining independence from one community to another is not the issue, but to make that confirmed and show that yes, we have gained our independence and we are an independent country, they need to establish a standardized language and assert that as a proof of being independent from the Swedes or the Russians. So they succeeded in their task, so that now the Finnish language has become a strong force in the nation's political life, and a strong marker of Finnish identity among Germanic tongues on the one side and Slavic tongues on the other. So in the 20th century, the Turks under Ataturk were likewise successful in their attempt to both standardize and modernize Turkish. So today we can see similar attempts at rapid standardization in countries such as India, where Hindi language is spoken, Israel, where Hebrew language is spoken, Papua New Guinea, where Tok Pisin is spoken, Indonesia, where Bahasa Indonesia, and Tanzania, where Swahili is spoken. So in each case, a language or a variety of languages had to be selected, developed in its resources and functions, and finally accepted by the larger society. So as we have seen, standardization is an ideological matter. So Williams in 1992 calls it a socio-political process involving the legitimization and institutionalization of a language variety as a feature of sanctioning of that variety as socially preferable. So it creates a preferred variety of a language, which then becomes the winner in a struggle for dominance. So this preferred variety are basically losers. So the standardized process occasionally results in some languages actually achieving more than one standardized variety. Now Norwegian is a good example with two standards, Nordnorsk and Bokmål. So in this case there is a special problem. Now that of trying to unify the two varieties in a way that pleases everyone. So in Norwegian they have difficulty to please everyone because Nordnorsk and Bokmål are both the two different types of varieties that are used to please everyone. So some kind of unification or amalgamation is now official government policy. So countries with two or more competing languages that cannot possibly be unified may tear themselves apart, as we saw in Yugoslavia. So, or periodically seems to become very close to doing that, as with the Belgium or Canada. So those communities went through that too. Now standardization is also an ongoing matter for only dead languages like Latin and Classical Greek are standardized for all the time. So Latin and Greek are standardized and they cannot be changed. So living languages change, and the standardization process is necessarily an ongoing one. So you can standardize languages, but the living processes would be different. So it is also one that may be described as more advanced in languages like French or German, and less advanced in languages like the Bahasa in Indonesia and Swahili. So Hindi is still in the process of being standardized in India. So that process is hindered by widespread regional resistance to Hindi out of the fear that regional languages may be submerged, or if not submerged, quite diminished. Now, so far as standardization is concerned, there are problems with accepting local varieties and with the developing and teaching the existing standard as though it were a classical language like Sanskrit, and downplaying it as a living language. So Hindi is still often taught much like Latin in schools in the West. It is in many places an underused second language at best, and children are not encouraged to play in Hindi. So teachers rarely employ Hindi as a language of instruction. They will try to use a different language, especially like English. Likewise, the kinds of literature available in Hindi are still very limited. So there being shortages of everyday reading materials that might appeal to the young, for example, comic books, mystery stories, and collections of folk tales, all of that would consequently, the process of the standardization of a living Hindi is proving to be a slow one. So the standardization process is also obviously one that attempts either to reduce or to eliminate diversity and variety. So, however, now there may well be a sense in which such diversity and variety are natural to all languages. Now, assuring them of their vitality and enabling them to make a change. So let's say that according to that, if we say that to that extent standardization imposes a strain on languages, or if not on the language themselves, on those who take on the task of standardization. So that may be one of the reasons why various national academies have had so many difficulties doing their work, because they don't have a standardized language, you see. So when they don't have a standardized language, then it would be very, very different. Now, they are essentially in a no-win situation. Because if they would make Hindi a standardized language, then yes, they would be in a win-win situation. And let's say that it would be very different and maybe dealt with in a different way. You see, but once they don't have a standardized language, then it's very difficult to decide on the way that the formal education is going to move. So they are essentially in a no-win situation, always trying to fix the consequences of changes that they cannot prevent, and continually being compelled to issue new pronouncements on linguistic matters. So unfortunately, those who think you can standardize and fix a language for all time are quite often influential. That means that they think that yes, they can fix a language, and that means that they are influential in that, and they have some influence in doing that. So they often find ready access to the media, there to bewail the fact that English, for example, is becoming degenerate and corporate, and to advise us to return to what they regard as a more perfect past. Now, they may also resist what they consider to be dangerous innovations, for example, the translation of a sacred book into a modern idiom, or the issue of a new dictionary. So since the existence of internal variation is one aspect of a language, and the fact that all languages keep changing is another, we cannot be too sympathetic to such views, and we can't say that yes, that would be a sympathetic way of dealing with the language. So vitality, the second of Bell's 7 criteria, refers to the existence of a living community of speakers. Now, this criterion can be used to distinguish languages that are alive from those that are dead. So, 2 Celtic languages of the United Kingdom are now dead, the Manx and the old language of the Isle of Man, the Cornish. So there were 2 languages long ago established in the United Kingdom that were considered to be of the old language. Now, the old language is the language where long ago the languages, the Celtic languages, where the Old English was spoken, and it is supposed to be very, very different from what is spoken nowadays. So Cornish was one part of that language. So Manx died out about after the World War II. And Cornish disappeared at the end of the 18th century. And one date often cited being 1777, when the last known speaker, Dorothy Pentraith of Mossholt, died. So many of the Aboriginal languages, so there were Aboriginal people who were dealing with the old languages in the Old Testament. So many of the Aboriginal languages of the Americans are also dead. Now Latin is dead in this sense too, for no one that speaks it as a native language anymore. So it exists only in a written form, frozen in time. So pronouncement rather than spoken, and studied rather than used. So we pronounce Latin more with the spoken language, and it is studied rather than used as a separate language. So that is the difference. So once a language dies, it is gone for all time, and not even the so-called revival of the Hebrew contradicts that assertion. So Hebrew will always Hebrew has always existed in the spoken form as liturgical language, as did Latin for centuries. So modern Hebrew is an outgrowth of that liturgical variety. So we say that Hebrew would be modern way that it has sort of, we've grown out of that language, you see. So it is, after all, modern Hebrew and the necessary secularization of liturgical language to make it serve the purpose of modern life, that has not been an easy and uncontroversial matter. So many languages, while not dead yet, nevertheless are palpably dying. So some languages that are not dead at the moment, but they are dying because we are not maintaining those languages. So the number of people who speak them diminishes drastically each year. So once that language is not spoken in, let's say, a way, then that language sort of dies away, you see. People stop speaking it. And each year, and the process seems irreversible. It cannot be reversed. You can't bring it back. You see, so that the best one can say of their vitality is that it is flagging. So, for example, the French dialects spoken in the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey and Sark are rapidly on their way to extinction. So they are also dying away. So the Channel of Islands of Jersey, the French dialect spoken there, Guernsey and Sark, these are languages that we haven't heard of because they're dying away now. They're from the old time. So each year that passes brings a decrease in the number of languages spoken in the world nowadays. So we should note that a language can remain a considerable force even after it is dead. So that is, even after it is no longer spoken as everyone's first language and exists almost exclusively in one or more of the written forms, knowledge of which is acquired only through the formal education of a language. Now, classical Greek and Latin still have considerable prestige in the Western world, and speakers of the many languages continue to draw on them in a variety of ways. So, Sanskrit, when we talk about Sanskrit, is imported in the way to speakers of Hindi. the classical Arabic provides a unifying force and set of resources in the Islamic world. So when they do provide that source in the Islamic world, the classical Chinese has considerable influence, let's say, not only modern Chinese but also Japanese and Korean. So such influences cannot be ignored. You cannot ignore such influences, because the speakers of languages subject to such influences are generally quite aware of what is happening. And we can even say that such influence is part of their knowledge of the language. So sometimes classical Arabic provides a unifying force and set resources for the Islamic world, but classical Chinese has considerable influence, not only modern Chinese, but also Japanese and Korean. And such influences cannot be ignored, because the speakers of languages subject to these such influences are generally quite aware of what is happening and why the differences are happening. So we can even say that such influence is part of their knowledge of the language, and that's why they are influencing such. So we can also periodically observe deliberate attempts to throw off an influence perceived to be alien. So, for example, Ataturk's largely successful attempt to reduce the Arabic influence on Turkish, and periodic attempts to purify languages such as French and German of borrowings from English. So while in the case of Hebrew, a language used only in a very restricted way for religious observances was successfully expanded for everyday use. Now, we should note that a similar attempt to revitalize Gaelic in Ireland has been almost a complete failure. So they can't revive Gaelic language in that, because they've tried to do it as Hebrew, but it hasn't, they couldn't manage to do it. So historicity refers to the fact that a particular group of people find a sense of identity through using a particular language. Now, it belongs to them. Social, political, religious, and ethnic ties may also be important for that group, but the bond provided by a common language may prove to be the strongest tie of all. Now, in the 19th century, a German nation was unified around the German language, just as in the previous century, Russians had unified around a revitalized Russian language. So historicity can be long-standing. Speakers of the different varieties of colloquial Arabic make much of a common linguistic ancestry, as obviously do speakers of Chinese. So it can also be that, as with Hebrew, it can be appealed to as a unifying force among the threatened people. So autonomy is an interesting concept, because it is really one of feeling. A language must be felt by its speakers to be different from other languages. Now, however, this is a very subjective criterion. You see, Ukrainians say their language is quite different from Russian, and deplored its Russification when they were part of the Soviet Union. So even Ukrainians said that they speak Russian also, but they wanted to make it shown as a different culture and different environment. So even though when they were part of the Russian Union and the USSR, even then they wanted a different from their language to be different from Russian, and deplored its Russification when they were part of that. So some speakers of African American vernacular English maintain their language also, and is not a variety of English but is a separate language in its own right, and refer to it as Ebonics. So in contrast, speakers of Cantonese and Mandarin deny that they speak different languages. So they maintain that Cantonese and Mandarin are not autonomous languages, but are just two dialects of Chinese. So as we will see, Creole and Pidgin languages cause us not a few problems when we try to apply this criterion, but how autonomous are such languages. So reduction refers to the fact that a particular variety may be regarded as a subvariety rather than an independent entity. So sometimes it's just a subvariety instead of an independent situation. So speakers of Cockney will almost certainly say that they speak a variety of English and admit that they are not representative speakers of English, and recognize the existence of other varieties with equivalent subordinate status. So sometimes the reduction is in the kind of opportunities afforded to users of the variety. For example, there may be a reduction of sources, that is, the variety may lack a writing system, or there may be considerable restrictions in use. For example, Pidgin languages are very much reduced in the functions they serve in the society, and the contrast to standardized languages. So a mixture refers to feelings speakers have about the purity of the variety they speak. This criterion appears to be more important to speakers of some languages than of others. Now, for example, more important to speakers of French and German than to speakers of the English language. So French and German people would maybe be different, but the speakers of English would be different. Now, however, it partly explains why speakers of Pidgins and Creoles have difficulty in classifying what they speak as full languages. So these varieties are in certain respects quite obviously mixed. And the people who speak them often feel that the varieties are neither one thing nor another, but rather are debased, deficient, degenerate, or marginal varieties of some other standard language. So finally, having de facto norms refers to the feeling that many speakers have that there are both good speakers and poor speakers, and that the good speakers represent the norms of the proper usage. So sometimes this means focusing on one particular subvariety as representing the best usage. For example, Persian, French to the Florentine variety of Italian. Standards must not only be established by the first criterion above, they must also be observed. So when all the speakers, let's say, of a language feel that it is badly spoken or badly written almost everywhere, that language may have considerable difficulty in surviving the society. So in fact, such a feeling is often associated with a language that is dying. So concern with the norms of linguistic behavior, linguistic purism may become very important among specific segments of society. Now, for example, so far as English is concerned, there is a very profitable industry devoted to telling people how they should behave linguistically. Now, what it is correct to say and what to avoid saying, and so on. So if we apply the above criteria to the different varieties of speech we observe in the world, we will see that not every variety we may want to call language has the same status as every other variety. So English is a language, but so are Dogrib, Haitian Creole, Ukrainian, Latin, Tok-Pisin, and Chinese. So each satisfies a different subset of criteria from our list, although there are important differences among them. So we would be loath to deny that any one of them is a language. There are all equals as languages, but that does not necessarily mean that all languages are equal. So the first is a linguistic judgment, the second is a social one. So as we have just seen, trying to decide whether something is or is not a language, or in what ways languages are alike and different, can be quite troublesome. So you see, when we want to differentiate and say that, okay, whether we say a language, this thing is different in this language, or that thing is different in that language, and what ways languages are alike, or what are the similarities between the different languages, and difference can be quite troublesome. So that could be quite troublesome. However, we usually experience fewer problems of the same kind with regard to the dialects. So there is usually little controversy over the fact that they are either regional or social varieties of something that is widely acknowledged to be a language. Now, that is true even when even of the relationship of Cantonese and Mandarin to Chinese. So if the latter is given a generous interpretation as a language, then yes, it would be a huge difference. So some people are also aware that the standard variety of any language is actually only the preferred dialect of that language. Persian, French, Florentine, that would be on languages, dialects, and varieties in Italian, or in Zanzibar, variety of Swahili in Tanzania. So it is the variety that has been chosen for some reason, perhaps political, social, religious, or economic, or some combination of reasons, to serve as either the model or norm for other varieties. So it is the empowered variety. Now, as a result, the standard is often not called a dialect at all, but is regarded as a language itself. So sometimes they just don't say that it's a dialect, they would say that it's not a dialect, it's just a separate language. So it takes on an ideological dimension and becomes the same right and proper language of the group of people in the very expression of their being. So one consequence is that all varieties, other varieties, become related to that standard and are regarded as dialects of that standard, and with none of the power of that standard. Of course, this process usually involves a complete restructuring of the historical facts. So if language X1 differentiates in 3 areas to become dialects of XA, XB, and XC, then XA is elevated to become a later standard X2. Then XB and XC are really historical variants of X1, not subvarieties of X2. So what happens in practice is that XB and XC undergo pressure to change towards X2 and X2. The preferred variety of standard or standard exerts its influence over the other varieties. So we see a good instance of this process in modern English. The new standard is based on the dialect of the area surrounding London, which was just one of several dialects of Old English, and not the most important for both the Western and Northern dialects, which were once at least equally as important. So however, in the modern period, having provided the base for a standard English, this dialect exerts a strong influence over all the other dialects of England. So that it is not just the first among equals, but rather represents the modern language itself, to the extent that the varieties spoken in the West and North are generally regarded as its local variants. So they are considered as the local languages, or the local varieties. Now historically, these varieties arise from different sources, but now they are viewed only in relation to the standardized variety. So a final comment seems called for with regard to the terms language and dialect. A dialect is a subordinate variety of a language, so that we can say that Texas English and Swiss German are respectively dialects of English and German. the language name, English or German, is the superordinate term. We can also say of some languages that they contain more than one dialect. For example, English, French, and Italian are spoken in various dialects. So if the language is spoken, let's say, by so few people or so uniformly that it has only one variety, we might be tempted to say that language and dialect become synonymous in such a case. So we would say that yes, they have their similarities and they would become synonymous. Now, however, another view is that it is inappropriate to use dialect in such a situation because the requirement of subordination is not met. So consequently, to say that we have dialect A of language X must imply also that the existence of dialect B of language X. But to say that we have language Y is to make no claim about the number of dialect varieties in which it exists. So it may exist in only a single variety, or it may have two or more subordinate dialects, dialects A, B, and so on. So finally, the two other terms are important in connection with some of the issues discussed above. So vernacular and coinine. So coin Payet defines the former as the speech of a particular country or region, or more technically a form of speech transmitted from parent to child as a primary medium of communication. Now, if that form of speech is Standard English, then Standard English is the vernacular for that particular child. So if it is a regional dialect, then the dialect is the child's vernacular. Now, a coin is a form of speech shared by people of different vernaculars, though for some of them the coin itself may be their languages, their dialects and varieties vernacularly. So a coin is a common language, but not necessarily a standard one. It can be a common language, but it's not a standard one. Now, Payet's examples of coins are Hindi for many people in India, and vulgar Latin, vulgar, colloquial or spoken in the Roman Empire. So the original coin was, of course, the Greek coin of the ancient world, a unified version of the Greek dialects. So after which Alexander's conquest in circa 330 BCE became the lingua franca of the Western world. Now, a position it held until it was eventually superseded, not without a struggle, by vulgar Latin. So according to the discussion, a survey of the following kind might prove quite revealing. Ask a variety of people you know questions such as these, and then try to organize their responses in the systematic way. Now, which language do you speak, or languages do you speak? Do you speak a dialect of X? Now, where is the best X spoken? What is your native language or mother tongue? And do you speak X with an accent? If so, what accent? And also try to get definitions from your informants for each of the terms that you would use. So, a question found on many national census forms concerned the language or languages spoken or known. So it may ask respondents either to check one or more language names or to volunteer a name or names. So what problems do you see in collecting data in such a way? Think of countries like China, the United States, Canada, India, France, Spain, and Norway. So is Afrikaans a dialect of Dutch or a different language? To attempt an answer to this question, you will have to consider a variety of issues. What is the origin of Afrikaans? Are Afrikaans and Dutch mutually intelligible? How different are the orthographies? And that is the systems of spelling, the sounds, the vocabularies, the grammars. How important is the factor of the national consciousness? So what you want to see is that what is the origin of Africans? Are Africans and Dutch mutually intelligible? How different are the orthographies, the systems of spelling, the sounds, the vocabularies and grammars? How important is the factor of the national consciousness of those who speak Afrikaans? Is the initial question clearly answerable from the kinds of theories and data that are currently available to us? So speakers of Faroes are said to understand speakers of Icelandic, but not vice versa. So Danes seem to understand Norwegians better than Norwegians understand Danes. Now, monolingual speakers of Mandarin and Cantonese cannot communicate with each other in speech, because Cantonese is a completely different form of Chinese language, and Mandarin would be a different language. So what do such facts have to say about using the criterion of mutual intelligibility in deciding whether we are dealing with a single language, with two dialects of one language, or with two separate languages? So consider the following pieces of evidence in arriving at your answer. So speakers of Isoko in Nigeria say they cannot understand those who speak other Urhobo languages or dialects, but these others apparently understand them. So this situation seems to have developed concurrently with demands for greater political autonomy and ethnic self-sufficiency. So standard languages are usually based on an existing dialect of the language. For example, the British variety of English is based historically at least on the dialect of the area surrounding London. So continental French on the dialect of Paris, and Italian on the dialect of Florence or Tuscany although. So Rome and Milan became important influences in the late 20th century. In other countries, the situation is not so clear. So what you can find out about the difficulties of choosing a variety of standardization in Denmark, Indonesia, Greece, China, Haiti, and the Arab world. So Old English, if we study about Old English, the language spoken 1,000 years ago in England was a West Country variety of English, the West Saxon. So the court was located at Winchester, and the literature and documents of the period were written in West Saxon, or sometimes in Latin also. So by the 1400s, the English court was well established in London, which became the center of social, political, and economic power. So it also became the literary center of the country, particularly after the development of printing. So the variety of English spoken in and around London, including Oxford and Cambridge, which were important intellectual centers, became predominant. So how would you use facts such as these to argue that no variety of the language is intrinsically better than another, and that what happens to language is largely the result of the chance interplay of external forces? So can you think of other examples which might support such a conclusion? So Mencken wrote a series of books under the general title, The American Language. Now, why did he choose this particular title? Why not the English language in America? So if the English of the United States is properly regarded as a separate language, how about the varieties found in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and Singapore? So you might read Lilly's 2000 for a strongly expressed dismissal of Canadian English as a fiction without any value linguistically, pragmatically, socially, or politically. On page 9 you can see Klein in 1992 for a discussion of what he calls pluricentric languages. So one of the goals of Dr. Johnson set himself in compiling his dictionary of 1755 was to fix standardized English. What does Johnson say in the preface to that dictionary about his success in meeting that goal? So the publication in 1961 of Webster's third new international dictionary caused a tremendous stir in the North America, being regarded by many critics as an attack on prevailing language standards. So what were the issues? You can see Sled and Ebbett in 1962, Finnegan in 1980, and Ward Howe in 1999 for references related to this. One thing I would like to point out, students, is that when I am giving references to you of writers with the page numbers and that, these are important things. So it's not that you just read it and then you just ignore it. What I want you to do is I want you to check these links on the net and try to find this research work in those particular years, and then read those pages so that you are more acquainted to what the things that I am giving you in a brief overview. See, so writing of the codification of standard English, Leith in 1997 says that by analyzing correct usage in terms that only a tiny minority of educated people could command, the codifiers ensured that correctness remained the preserve of an elite. So the usage of most people was wrong precisely because it was the usage of the majority. So there appears to be more, to be both advantages and disadvantages of having a standard language. It is possible to make an objective assessment of these, or is any judgment inherently ideological? So if Scotland continues to devolve from England, what might this mean for the variety of English spoken there? Do you think it's going to change completely? So how might Scots become unequivocally a distinct variety of English? Unequivocally means that it would, how could they become that? And you can check Languages, Dialects and Varieties on 43. So Arabs have a particular historical view of Arab and Turks and Turkish. So try to find out something about these views. So once again, this is another question. Try to find out about the views of Arabs and Turks and of Turks and Turkish language. Hindi and Urdu are now viewed as rather different by those who speak these languages, so view that also. And how is each language being reshaped to conform to these views? So that is important. So how would you evaluate each of the following languages according to the criteria stated above: standardization, vitality, historicity, autonomy, reduction, mixture, and de facto norms? So that is for each criterion. Does the language possess this stated characteristic or lack it? So Haitian Creole, Provençal, Singapore English, Old English, Pitcairnese, African American Vernacular English, Tok-Pisin, Cockney, Ukrainian, and the language of Shakespeare's plays. These all have its own characteristics, and they are maybe different from each other in many ways. So their standardization is maybe different, their autonomy is maybe different, their mixture is different. So the whole norm of the language would be different, and they don't match each other. So, but then once again, these are these dialects or are these languages? So then we have to see, okay, if we say that they are languages, then we want to see how are they different from the normal version of language, or let's say English that we speak. How is Old English different from the now modern English, and how the language of Shakespeare's plays would be different from the language that we speak nowadays. So, dear students, I think that would be enough for you to ponder on about. You need to rely to these slides. You need to check out the different references that I give you on the internet and try to understand the different views of the different researchers and what exactly we have studied. So trying to understand the exact things that we have covered today, you can do that by checking the references also. So what I would say is try to work on this in a fact that it would help you learn why all this is different and what different characteristics would you choose in differentiating between a language and a dialect. So anyway, take care of yourselves and I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you so much. Good day.